So welcome everyone to Excess, Aesthetics, Gender, Performance, a roundtable discussion. My name is Greg Newton. I am the co-founder of the Bureau of General Services Queer Division. And I am here in the Bureau with Joe E. Jeffries, our moderator. The Bureau, for those of you who don't know, is, we like to say, a government agency for a government that does not yet exist. And we're a queer bookstore. So we're located on the second floor of the LGBT Community Center in Manhattan. And we are open again, thankfully. So our hours are now Wednesdays through Sundays from 1 to 7. But we are still doing lots of virtual events, which allows us to connect with people all over the place, as you'll soon see. And we're very happy about that. So I'm going to introduce our panelists and our moderator, and then we will get started. They're each going to present their books for a few minutes and then have a conversation. And then we'll do a Q&A at the end, which you can enter into the chat function, or you can just raise your hand and we'll call on you and you can ask your question yourself. So let's begin with the bios. Jillian Hernandez is Associate Professor at the Center for Gender, Sexualities, and Women's Studies Research at the University of Florida. She created Women on the Rise, an outreach initiative that introduces contemporary art and artists and offers art-making praxis to young Black and Latina women in Miami. She discusses this in her critically acclaimed book, published by Duke University Press, Aesthetics of Excess, the Art and Politics of Black and Latina Embodiment. Thank you. Meredith Heller is a senior lecturer of queer studies in the Women's and Gender Studies program at Northern Arizona University. She specializes in queer theory and critical identity studies with additional expertise in performance studies and digital media. Queering Drag, Redefining the Discourse of Gender Bending won the Popular Culture Association's 2021 John Leo and Dana Heller Award for Best Book in LGBTQ Studies and was named one of NBC's 10 LGBTQ books to watch out for in 2020. I love having you. Can you do all of our events and you can be my Vanna White?
Yeah.
You're hired. Yeah. Dr. Lynn Sally is a scholar and practicing artist. She received her PhD in Performance Studies from New York University and MA in Gender Studies and Feminist Theory from the New School for Social Research. Her recent book, Neo-Burlesque, Striptease as Transformation, Rutgers University Press, 2022, has been hailed a smart feminist tour de force must read by Annie Sprinkle and Beth Stevens. She also writes creative nonfiction at Medium and LynnSally.com. Finally, Joe E. Jeffries is a drag historian. He teaches theater studies at New York University and the New School and has video documented NYC's vibrant drag and burlesque scenes for over a dozen years. See samples of his video work at vimeo.com/Joe E. Jeffries. So please put your hands together visibly and welcome our panelists. So now I've already forgotten who's going first.
Yeah, so now we're just going to take a few minutes and go through our panelists and ask them to talk for a few minutes about their books. Can you give us an introduction? So Lynn wanted to go first, right? So let's go with Lynn. Lynn, tell us about the fabulous book, Neo-Burlesque.
Great. I put my timer on so I don't talk too much. I just want to thank Meredith and Jillian and Greg and Joe. This was my brainchild, and I'm a huge fan of everyone's work here. And so I'm really excited to be here. So I want to thank you and I want to thank the Bureau. So I wrote this book to document and as a tribute to women who are deemed to be quote unquote too much. Women who use excess and artifice as central to their art making and who they are, and women who put their bodies on display in these unapologetic and, in the case of burlesque, these very public ways. So this book documents the emergence of the neo-burlesque scene in New York City through 7 case studies and a very, very, very long introduction. And so when I was preparing for this roundtable, I actually went ahead and looked at, thank you to my indexer and thank you to Meredith for recommending her. They are magical creatures of a sort. And I went back and I looked at the uses of excess in my book, and I was surprised by how comprehensive it was and across the text and not just a few moments in the intro or framing. And so I think will be a interesting conversation to have around this. So I previously defined, before I wrote this book, I previously defined burlesque as glamorous, campy, parodic, excessive, and salacious or blue. So for me, the excess has always been central to burlesque. And then later in this book, I've sort of added to this definition. And one of the things that I liked that I wrote about was that this like exuberant, flamboyant, excessive theatrical dressing encompasses not just the physical components of costuming and makeup and wigs and sets, but also this like irreverent attitude, this excessive attitude and stance towards social norms and social expectations. The exaggerated presentation in burlesque, it's not mere window dressing. It's not just something that is tangential to what's going on. Instead, I want to think of it as an integral component of burlesque's ethos and its power to infect. And I'm purposely using that metaphor of contagion. So this exaggeration and this excess, this physical, psychic, and social excess. The excess of the excess is what I'm sort of thinking about. That remainder, that's kind of like, that's the site of my investigation, or so I'd like to think. So excess defies the social conventions, and throughout the text, I use Kathleen Rowe's notion of the unruly woman. And this is a quote from Rowe. Through her body, her speech, and her laughter, especially in the public sphere, the unruly woman creates a disruptive spectacle of herself. Unruly women are recognized in part for the ways, that was an end quote. So they're recognized for the ways that they stake claim to their voices and their bodies through excess. So their bodies are excessive, their personas are expressive, their facial expressions are excessive, and thereby it represents this sort of prototypical body of Mikhail Bakhtin's Carnivalesque. And so I talk in the book about the upending of social norms through the grotesque body, through this idea of monster beauty, and also through the defying of beauty ideals via something I call parodic pageantry. So in the text, I define that as the exaggerated presentation and celebration of artifice. So burlesque offers a space where women who are too much can express themselves unapologetically and publicly. Women who may be considered too old or too short, or a myriad of other unmentioned but implied excesses such as too fat, to use their bodies to express their sexuality in public ways. So not so coincidentally, these bodies may refuse to conform to mainstream beauty ideals. And that's what I talk about when I discuss this sort of backlash against burlesque. This taboo around stripping, it's not just the body on display. Miley Cyrus is swinging around butt naked on a wrecking ball, but underlying the taboo is more than simply the fear of the explicit body. The bodies on a burlesque stage are invited to occupy space of sexual agency and excess. And when those bodies, it's telling me I'm done, so let me wrap up. But when those bodies are self-possessed and challenging mainstream ideas of beauty, a number of social taboos are broken. So one of the things that I explore in the text is that it's not just bodies on display, but it's the women performing and the people performing this unabashed, excessive display of their body and their politics, known as the Neo-Burlesque movement. So thank you. I'll pass it on to the next person.
Thank you, Lynn. Let's bring in Jillian next to continue this discussion of too muchness In this case, specifically as it relates to the Black and Latina women that you work with in Miami in the WOTR, Women on the Rise.
It's a lot. It is a mouthful for
sure.
Get
those acronyms straight. So talk to us about excess and too muchness and how the and the way they dress are considered inappropriate, I suppose.
Yeah. So again, thank you all for having me. I'm just going to share a few slides. I won't be showing all of these. But my book, Aesthetics of Excess, definitely follows the thread that Lynn laid out so beautifully, but through the particular lens of thinking of Black and Latina women and girls' racialization or sexual racialization. The book really, oh, I'm sorry. I thought I heard someone. The book emerges out of over a decade of doing community arts work through a collective that I founded in 2004 called Women on the Rise. We were based out of the Museum of Contemporary Art in North Miami, Florida, and you see some of us in the collective there. And so what we would do was we would go out into the community and have workshops with the girls, either in summer programs, the Juvenile Detention Center, other sites, and we would share the work of contemporary women artists. So here is a project inspired by Lorraine O'Grady's Art Is project. And we would just use the artwork as a space to have dialogue with the girls around embodiment, gender, sexuality, school, whatever was going on. This is some work inspired by Yayoi Kusama. We also would teach about the work of Zanele Muholi and worked with queer girls. And I have a whole chapter of the book that centers on my conversations with them on what I call the aesthetics, erotics of masculinity, and how they use masculinity as a kind of erotic currency. So these are the photos that they created, inspired by Zanele Muholi. So in my book, even though I'm using the word excess, I don't actually attribute excess to my participants. That, you know, it's clear that that is a sort of imposed label, but I play with it nonetheless, because I do think that there's something about what Lynn just mentioned as like the unruliness of that very perception of excess that I think has the possibility to sort of push back on particular expectations and respectability politics in particular that police the bodies of women and girls of color, particularly those who are working class, particularly those who are dark-skinned, and even more so those who are queer. And so the book really emerges from my travels, both as an instructor in Women on the Rise, but then like my own personal experiences of negotiating respectability politics. So in the book, I talk about this one moment when the girls compared me to a Bratz doll. And I thought myself like such an artsy fartsy person. And I couldn't believe at the time, this was like in 2007, that I was like compared to a Bratz doll. And now I totally love it and have like a little Bratz avatar. But at the time, it seemed like something so anathema to like my own idea of myself. And so that became a point for me to like really think about like, well, what's wrong with looking like a Bratz doll, right? Like what's the sort of internalized respectability politics that I have? At the very same time as this Bratz doll conversation was happening, there was a YouTube video called Chongalicious that featured 2 young Latina girls, and they were it was a parody of chongas, which is a derogatory term to describe working class Latina girls who wear hoop earrings and have gelled up hair. And I became really interested in why this parody that was very mocking had so much currency. So it was like the song from it was playing on Power 96, and they were being interviewed on like international Spanish language radio networks like Univision and Telemundo. And so I became interested in the ways in which this excessive girlhood, racialized girlhood, was both something to be mocked and contained, but also something that accrued particular forms of value as it moved through different cultural registers. So from popular culture, like here we're looking at, the New Times, which is the weekly in Miami. And then you had these really intense, agitated responses to the growing visibility of chongas. So on this blog, someone writes, I grew up with females like this and it's gross. How can people admire this shit? This makes me want to move away from here so bad. They're your stereotypical ghetto Hispanics who cause uproar for attention. So the politics of class, right? The politics of belonging and sexuality. And so in the book, I offer the term sexual aesthetic excess to theorize, right, the too muchness of working class Blackness and Latinidad. I talk about it as a discourse that correlates fashion deviancy with sexual impropriety. And again, rather than just saying this is a way in which we're racialized, I'm also interested in sort of lingering in that excessive racialization to see what it offers for really exploding these categories. And lastly, really quickly, I just want to show you some of the levels of sort of shaming that happen. So chongas show up on Cristina, which is like, the Latin equivalent of Oprah, let's say. And there's a chonga makeover, of course. There's chongas who are being derided for their style. But then at the very same time, I examined contemporary art, especially contemporary art that emerged at the same time. This is an image that was at the Whitney Biennial of 2002 by a Miami-based artist, Louis Gisbert, who traffics in images of chonga girls, but is able to sort of create, these images actually created a whole career for him in the contemporary art world. And the same goes for Nikki S. Lee. Many people are familiar with her project series of photographs. And the most famous of these is also the one where she is in this chonga-fied presentation. So I sort of follow the thread from my own experiences of body policing through the notions of excess to those of the girls I work with, and then those in popular culture and contemporary art. So I'm happy to discuss more. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Jillian. Thank you very much. Next, let's move to Meredith with Queering Drag, and tell us about your book and project and how it intersects with this idea of excess. If you watch RuPaul's Drag Race, you know that Michelle Visage believes drag is nothing but exaggeration and bigger, right? So, but you're changing the discourse. This book fascinates me. Absolutely. So please tell us about your book.
Thanks for having me. So when I do research, I focus on identity discourse, and then I also look at identity embodiment. And specifically, I'm interested in how descriptive methods we have of like explaining, describing things, sometimes have a hard time capturing like queer work we can do with our bodies, and that includes like bodily excess, right? Things that don't fit into normative ways of describing. So Queering Drag is my book. It looks at 4 examples of theatrical gender bending. We do male impersonators in variety and vaudeville. I look at kind of like the sexless bending of El Teatro Campesino's Teatristas. I look at queer butch nightclub performers, and then I also look at contemporary drag kings. I actually think the case studies are probably the most interesting part of the book. So if anybody wants to talk about those case studies specifically later, I'm down. But these are all really complex forms of theatrical gender bending with very specific time and place located intents, methods, and impacts, right? And I think commercial gender bending, at least, is always political because it's always commenting on gender system, actually commercial or non-commercial. I think if you're doing drag, it's political because you're messing with identity systems. And you always have the potential to disrupt those systems because you're presenting them in queer ways. Now, does gender bending always do this? Absolutely not. Does it always intend to do this? Absolutely not. Does it have the potential? Yes, because of the medium you're choosing to enact embodied expression. I also think it's like a lot easier to like get a performance or like understand a performance when you're there, because theater is made to be like in person, like you're communicating, like you're expressing in a way to communicate to the audience, like you're learning in different embodied ways. But the problem is that showing up and going to a performance requires access, time, money, and ability. And for the first 3 examples in my book, you would also need a time machine because they're in the past. So how do people outside of this experiential sphere experience this queer potentiality, this potentiality for like excess, for like learning new things? Well, we have photos, we have videos, but like the number one thing we turn to, the first thing we usually turn to is words. Somebody describes an act to you. Somebody tells you, I just saw this show, or I watched RuPaul's Drag Race. Or you do a Google search and you look at what pops up, or you pull up your Instagram and you read the captions, right? So generally we turn to discourse, like usually word discourse, and then we might go and seek out, is there a show in my area, or can I drive to an area, take a bus to an area to watch a show, right? So a lot of my book is actually looking at the ways gender bending performances have been like discursively characterized through this like limited cachet of words we have to explain queerness. That's like the opposite of excess, right? To limit, to define. And so to like tie it back to the theme of the roundtable, like a ton of, not every gender bending act, but like a ton of gender bending acts are intentionally enacted with multiple identity meanings, contradictory meanings, new meanings. That's excess, right? I have a whole chapter where I talk about like if you go to a drag king show, you're going to see like a whole bunch of like wild things that happen, like some traditional things, but like so many different things can happen, right? But unless we begin to build new words and new ways to describe drag, that potentiality for building new queer worlds or new queer ideas is always going to be circumscribed. You would be shocked how many of my queer studies students only understand drag from like RuPaul's Drag Race or like the Google search they did, right? They're like in queer studies classes, they're like queer studies minors, and that's how they understand it. So if we really want to create that queer spreadability, and really it's important to start spreading queerness because that's an access issue. Not everybody can show up to a performance, right? We really have to create new definitions and new discursive ways for characterizing drag. So that's what I attempted to do in this book. So we'll see how it goes.
Thank you, Meredith. I at first was shocked by the number of my students who hadn't actually seen a live drag performance. And yeah, and you know, it was kind of shocking. It's like, wow, you're here studying this. And I realized some of them were underage. They couldn't legally get into a bar, you know, and then I realized there are fake IDs and whatnot. But yeah, it is. So thank you. That's a great kind of introduction to this, what Charles Ludlam might call virtuoso maximalism. I think we have achieved some virtuoso maximalism tonight. I wanted to ask everybody now individually, because most of the authors, you've approached this through a participating strategy. It's firsthand observation, firsthand involvement with the material. So would somebody like to jump in and talk to me about the writing process, your research process, and how each of you, it's not really a removed thing, you're there, you're with it. Lynn is performing in burlesque. Jillian was working with the Black and Latina women. Meredith, you are attending drag shows. Like you say, we can't get back into the vaudeville days. We wish we could, right, to see some of this stuff. But talk to us about your research methods through this. Who would like to go?
Lynn, I'd love to hear what you have to say. You've been practicing burlesque for like 20 years.
Yes, Lynn, talk to us about that.
Okay, yeah. So I didn't plan on writing this book. I actually never thought about writing about burlesque because it was a thing that I did. So for me, it felt a little strange. And of course, there's this long history of, you know, ethnographers such as Zora Neale Hurston kind of getting some shade for studying the culture that she was from. And so, you know, I wasn't taking field notes backstage when I'm on my third martini of closing out the slipper room 15, 20 years ago. But, you know, but still those experiences like informed, they've informed how I look at this art form. And I think that in terms of methodology, one thing that I had to do was to go back and conduct interviews with these people who they're friends of mine. I had to conduct original interviews with them because even though I had access to interviews that they've done in the past, it seemed to me I picked the performers that I wanted to talk about either because they had a performance that really engaged me or there was something that to me that they embodied that thing. So the chapter on Little Brooklyn is really a chapter that explores comedy and humor. And she to me was like a quintessential character in which to talk about that. So in the book, I actually argue that I'm not doing a participation observation. I'm a participant, and I define burlesque as both performing art and a participatory culture. So for me, that was really important, and I consider each chapter a little love letter because these are acts and people that I love. And so to me, it's just such an honor to to be able to bring these, as Meredith made this really excellent point, that, to bring these things to light requires perhaps a different type of language. And so that's how my background sort of informed the work that I did here.
Thank you. Jillian, in your book, you talk a lot about the Women on the Rise workshops, and I also like in your book that you have the interlude sections that actually have work that was derived out of the workshop. So could you talk about the whole program?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the same vein as Lynn just shared, I never really set out to write a book about women on the rise. So I started it before I went to grad school. Yeah, in many ways, I just kept sort of sitting with throughout graduate school, like the questions and the observations that I had around the ways in which girls' bodies were policed in extreme ways in a space like the detention center, but also like the everyday mundane ways that through offhand comments and etc. These forms of policing happen. And so when I resumed working on the project following graduate school, I did have, certain conversations with the girls that were recorded. And so I transcribed them, I draw on them extensively, but I also sort of bring in my own autoethnography into it. And then the interludes, so I have 4 interludes in the book, and they're places where I have transcripts that just sort of linger and float. I have images that are just sitting without any analysis. And I think for me, those were places to just sort of allow the girls' work to just be, or for their bodies to just be, or for us to just sit and have the reader sort of engage more directly with their voice without my sort of analytical, work sort of happening. So for me, those were really important. And at times they continue the narrative arc of the book. At times they sort of take it somewhere else. And so for me, that was really important. And one thing I talk about in the epilogue is that this program became implicated in really intense art world gentrification in 2014 in Miami. And so archiving the work that we did was really urgent. And the book sort of became also a vehicle not only to sort of analyze and theorize, but it became like our archive, and we still can't access through the museum a lot of our archives and all of this collective labor that we did. So it's a very sort of multivocal conversation, and it really highlights that the dialogical, like what it means to be in conversation. And so a lot of the book is drawn from conversations, often very messy, impassioned ones, contradictory ones. But for me, that was just such a productive way to do that, and also to sort of play around with the conventions of art history. Like, I consider myself an art historian, but this book is so sort of anathema to the way that art history is written. So I'm making a few different moves there, but definitely sort of the emphasis on dialogue and creative practice was really important.
Thank you. And Meredith, talk to me about your work in archives and the things that you found in archives, lacking in archives, and then the shows that you were attending firsthand. Like you say, it is about access and time and money and location and all sorts of things.
Yeah, so I did a ton of archival work. And one of the things I was like very wary about was like, what kind of words are people using? How are they describing these acts? Does it fit with these acts? Like, I can't see them. I can't see a video. I can't go see them. So I was like, every time I went into an archive or I read somebody's description of something, I was like extremely wary of like the words they were using. And I was like reading against those words. And it was like very meticulous work. And then I would go to drag shows and I would just be like, it would just like wash over me and I wasn't thinking about anything. And it was like the opposite of that meticulous work. And I would sometimes take notes and the notes are like nonsensical. They would be like, but I like somebody dripped honey on their bodies. It's like, what am I doing with that, right? And then again, I had this responsibility that I was like, somebody's gonna say to like, what'd you see tonight? And I was gonna have to put it into words. And I was already being so critical of so many of these other people who were very well-intentioned, who put things into words in like very limited and circumscribed ways. So it's like a huge responsibility to like balance that and try to figure out like how we can describe, especially like some of the weird, queer, excessive stuff that happens. Like if an act's easy to describe, great, but most of the acts are not going to be. So it was a big responsibility to like make sure that I wasn't reproducing those patterns. And very likely I did. In my conclusion, I kind of say like, well, I'm making a language project, right? And that is inherently hierarchical and that's inherently like based into the system. I just hope this system is better than the system that I was like having to use to like describe these like drag shows that I was going to go see. I was seeing when I was a grad student.
Great, thank you. Jillian, you were kind of getting at this idea, but I'd like for everyone to talk a little bit about their relationship to institutions with their work and what that's about, how your work works within institutions, conflicts with institutions, may exclude you from institutions, bring you into institutions, how that may be in conflict with the people, the groups you're working with.
Yeah, I mean, the institutional politics are really form, like it's what the epilogue is really the place where I work through that. And it's so complicated, right? Because the institution, this elite contemporary art museum made our work possible. So I want to acknowledge that it made it possible for me to pay these women artists really well to do really meaningful work. And it's still work that I still find the most rewarding work I've ever done and probably will ever do, to be honest. Like we still all marvel at the fact that we were paid to hang out together and do this work, like truly, you know. And so of course it couldn't last too long. But you know, even while the program was well funded and running well, there were ways in which we were definitely touted out when you know, a certain rich donor wanted to sort of feel good about themselves. And sometimes, you know, they would want to come observe the girls as if it was some kind of weird, you know, like social experiment. So navigating that, but then also navigating, sometimes we would have corrections officers and teachers feel threatened by the work that we were doing and what we were teaching. So we also had to like navigate that. We were always visitors, so we never had full autonomy of a given space. We were always there sort of at the, at someone's sort of, good graces. So navigating that was really intense. And then navigating institutionally sort of, moments where girls were getting in trouble and where sometimes, to be honest, they would be getting in trouble because of the work that we were doing, and just sort of ways that we had to sit with ourselves and think very carefully about how could we avoid sort of creating harm, like obviously not intentionally, but creating situations where that might occur. And so, yeah, I mean, for me, I feel like I was pushed out of the museum and pushed into the academy, to be honest with you. And I think that I'm still sort of sitting with lessons from that. And for me now, it's more about how can people engage in this kind of work with as much autonomy as possible, because so much labor and so much intellectual work has really been, straight up stolen from those of us in the collective. So there's a lot of heartache at the end of this book about that whole process.
And Lynn, you talk about, the first sentence in your book is, I am a stripper. And so you talk about not being pushed into the academy, but a fear being pushed out of the academy. And you actually talk about various people who are burlesque performers who have been pushed out of the academy once that was discovered. Could you address that further?
Yeah, I know for a fact I will never have a job again in the academia in academia after writing this book. Like there's just no way, because I do make this very bold statement to, kind of stop hiding behind this like supposed objectivity of scholarship. And I could have written this book as a scholar and removed myself from it. But to me, it did two things. First of all, that kind of erases my 2 decades of experience. And yes, I don't remember every single moment of it. But it would erase all of that experience. And I think that's valuable. Like, I think like my lived embodied experience, not as a researcher coming in this, but actually being a person that was in the participant, was in the community, participating in the community is significant. And it was important to me too, because it sort of, to me, I'm like, here are these women like going for it, unapologetically on stage, stripping yourself bare, not just your body, but your politics and your ideas, and talk about some weird shit that happens, Meredith, right? Like you can see some pretty avant-garde burlesque acts where you're like, what? This person is special. And it just seemed to me to like undermine the entire project, for me to just be like, I'm neutral and I'm going to write in the third person, to me was antithetical to the project. And I'm putting it a little, if I can do a little plug, I wrote an article that I put up on Medium about this idea of being too much. And this reporter doing a journalist that was doing an article about me, and her editor didn't believe that I taught at NYU, right? Because there was this disconnect between somebody who was a practicing striptease artist or burlesque performer, or I call myself a female impersonator. Like there was a disconnect between that and somebody who has that academic approach. So I sent her a link to my class at NYU, and she still didn't believe me. At the end of the day, I actually had to send her my pay stub because the syllabus wasn't enough. It just got ridiculous. And I was just like, this is crazy. And so to me, it's like everything that we're talking about, there's no going back. There's no getting back in. And unless the institution changes, unfortunately, I'm not going to. I feel like that was my political running for president of the new radical university. My political campaign.
Thank you. Vote for Dr. Lucky. And Meredith, what has the institutional reaction been to your work, would you say? Or how is your work playing through?
Yeah, that's so interesting and troubling, Lynn, what you said, because I feel like I wasn't doing drag, but this book topic was super embraced by the Academy. Like originally it was, I was teaching, I was in a theater studies graduate program, and I was teaching in feminist studies, and I was having a really hard time reconciling words. So I was like, I'm going to do a project and describe gender bending, and everybody's like, that's great. I wrote my dissertation, everybody's like, wonderful, we love it. I submitted to publishers. They were like, we'd love to publish this, right? So because I wasn't a practitioner, certainly we can't engage in, there's no such thing of objectivity. Like I was engaging in this and putting my own POV on it, but because I wasn't actually practicing and I was kind of analyzing it in this very academic way, everybody's like, and actually, I was talking about this before we started the panel, this is actually a big concern of mine, because I feel like what I'm saying about we need to change our words, and if we do so, we can understand drag more broadly and that it can really help some misconceptions about drag. And I feel because it's such an academic project, it sometimes gets prevented from going out and affecting people outside of the academy, right? So the academy, the institution of the academy is like a gatekeeper, and it says like, Lynn, you're too much. And then also it's a gatekeeper of these ideas because I'm writing in like, you know, academic language, which is very jargonistic, and people read it and they're like, I'm not gonna like continue reading this to get to this idea that might really help a lot of people understand like queerness and excess and embodiment a little bit better.
No, yeah, thank you. That sums up a lot. I think maybe we should go one more round of kind of general question for everybody, and then open up for questions around. So I wanted to ask everybody, now that you've written the books, they've been out there in the universe for a spell, you've been thinking about them, is there a chapter that you would write now or add to it, or that you wish you had written, that you had some research that you just hadn't quite formulated yet, but now you're going, yeah, that would be what I would add to the book. In the next edition, I might add this or go in that direction?
I don't think there's anything I would add. I would actually trim so much. To be completely honest with you, I'm like, ooh, that intro is long. Ooh, like I get exhausted reading it, like truly. So it's like so much. But I do think it would be cute. Like now, I'm like interested in like, it would be nice to have like a kind of companion like journal or like some kind of other piece that folks could sort of work through some of the questions that I have here, but in a way that would prompt them to write about their own experiences. So I'm really thinking about different modes. And Lynn, I just want to affirm you. And I love that you have sort of reached this place, because the institution will just like never love us. And so I love that you're using medium and like these different ways of accessing. So for my next book, I think I'm thinking like slimmer, trimmer, and, you know, ways to also, you know, just circulate it in different ways. So I would just go in and cut a bunch of stuff up.
Minimalism. Make the aesthetics of excess minimal. There you go. Gotcha.
Totally.
So one of my book reviewers was like, this project is great, but you got to cut like 10,000 words. And at the time I was like, what? Not my prose, but no, I'm so glad that I followed his advice. That was Marlon Bailey. He's like so smart. He made me cut so much out of the book, and it's like great because it's already like too much, right? When we write so much, and it's like I didn't need that. But I would say the one area of my book that I didn't think twice about was in my introduction at the end. I kind of made this, I was like pissed off one day, and I made this statement about how I was like a permanent faculty who's not tenure track, and how that was like really exploitative, and how like non-tenure track people like can't finish projects like this. And then also like there's so many other adjuncts who don't have my advantages and my privileges. Like I had friends in the academy who like do labor for me. Like I had a secure job, I had like health insurance through my job. And it's just like one throwaway paragraph at the end. And every time somebody like reads my book on Twitter, they will like screenshot that part and like post it up. And it was such a throwaway thing, but it's like really resonated with a lot of people. And it just really makes me think that like, I feel like maybe that's the most important part of my book, that I just like spoke to the truth of my experience, and then the truth of like our work situations, and like how books like this are created. And I thought the press was going to make me take it out, and they just didn't see it. And nobody noticed it, and then it just got published. But I think in the future, statements like that, they just like made such a huge impact that I didn't think. And so I think it's really important for me to always include that kind of stuff in my work in the future.
Yeah, I thought that was a fascinating part of your book, Meredith, to be honest. I was like, that's so interesting. So when you asked the question about institutions, I was thinking about that with you. And Jillian, I love this idea of a workbook, of creating a workbook where people can kind of like work through it. For sure, everybody picks this book up and they just like scroll through and look at the images. So I think just doing a picture book, like a coffee table, and pulling out quotes. And not to like encourage illiteracy, but just to like reach, as you're saying, like reach another market. But the chapter I would add, so I framed the emergence of the Neo-Burlesque movement in New York City after so it went through 2 peer reviews, and that's a discussion for another day. But I decided my book deserved more. And thank you to Kim, who's here from Rutgers University Press, who picked it up and also told me to cut 10,000 words. So I did that also. But so when I got my reviews back that second time, and thank you very much to the anonymous reviewers who did me such a service. And they were like, you have to talk about race. And I was like, it was white back then, but that wasn't enough. So I went back and I did 4 original interviews, and I framed the entire emergence of the scene through not exclusionary practices, but non-inclusionary practices. And I think that once I was there, I was at the very, 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 and I did a really, what I think was an important brief intro, and there's so much more work that needs to be done, but to frame it like that was really important. And if I had more time, I would have done an entire chapter specifically on the Brown Girls Burlesque group that emerged in 2006, which really was like a half a decade to a decade past the time period that I'm examining. So if I were to do it over, but picture books are common. Okay, I can tell you that for sure.
Okay, thank you all. Let's open it up to each other to start with. Any questions that any of the authors would like to ask each other based on your readings of the book, what you've heard tonight, anything that was sparking you any?
Lynn, I would love to hear about how your burlesque community has received the book.
Well, it technically came out like, what was that? 13 days ago, 14 days ago.
It's a baby.
So yeah, it's a little baby, but it's been getting, folks have been sharing it. The most important part is that the people that are in the book that I focus on are really enthusiastic about it, documenting a moment, and I think that that's really important. And so I want to say, I just want the people who are in the book to be happy with it, but the start for me. And so I'm looking forward to dialogue about it, because I make it very clear that this is not the book on burlesque, it is a book. And it is just, we're just opening, it's like barely a drop of sand on a giant, beautiful, a giant, beautiful beach. And I'm hoping, and I know that there will be more, and there's a lot of graduate students and scholars doing work on this. So I'm really excited about what happens in the future. And I'm hoping we can have conversations. I did go to the New York Burlesque Festival, and we had a panel, a Q&A with performers. And we started to talk about race and the exclusionary practices at the time in which Neo-Burlesque was emerged. And I think that we have to continue to do that. So I'm excited. We'll see what happens.
Yay.
I have a question specifically for Meredith. Being here in New York, I was kind of fascinated by your discussion of Stormy DeLavier and the idea of, you call Stormy queer butchness, and you talk about Stormy as counter-identification. So I was wondering if you could just elaborate for the people who haven't read your book, this idea of the Stormy as a queer butch, and the idea that male impersonator fails, at least in your opinion, what Stormy was doing.
Yeah, so this was actually a new chapter that I added just for the book. It wasn't in my original dissertation. And I wanted to focus on Stormy but I really wanted to look at like what Stormy was doing, which was like a drag act, except Stormy was living kind of butch and then performing butch, and that butch on stage was like more slicked up and fancier, but also not like really different than how Stormy lived in everyday life. And I found that especially in New York and Harlem, you could trace this kind of like butch nightclub drag-esque through like Black culture. And Marlon Bailey talks about this quite a bit in Butch Queens Up in Drags, where he kind of like traces ballroom culture too. But I really wanted to nod to different types of drag or gender bending where people were doing something that was like very culturally readable. And Stormy was doing this. There's a big history in the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s, 1910s and 1920s with Gladys Bentley, who was doing this. So Stormy was really taking this cultural performance and then moving it out of just like Black culture, because Stormy was performing as part of the Jewel Box Review, which was integrated, but largely white 1950s, 1960s, female impersonation, like traveling show. And I think they had headquarters in New York, right? And if you don't know Stormy from this type of performance, and a lot of people don't, you might know Stormy because Stormy was one of the instigators of the Stonewall Rebellion. And so I find it very interesting that Stormy had this like very butch look, could oftentimes mistaken for a man, so could kind of pass as a man. And Stormy made sure that when Stormy expressed identity, they looked very queer. So they were not interested in passing in any way. They weren't interested in blending in any way. This type of butch act they did on stage, and also kind of the butchness they lived in everyday life, was a way to express queerness. And actually that got Stormy in a lot of trouble. Stormy like got beat up during Stonewall and stuff. So it became very dangerous. So I find it interesting that people who kind of use drag to express queerness, right, as kind of an indicator of sexuality, is like, sometimes you can't see it unless you do it, right? So sometimes people express their sexuality by like looking more genderqueer, and Stormy was like really committed to that, both in Stormy's stage act and also in everyday life. And by the way, Stormy's like pretty unclear with pronouns, so I don't use any pronouns with Stormy, and it's like quite difficult. But words, again, back to my book, words are super important. And so not using terms like male impersonator, not saying butch lesbian, and not saying she, her when I'm not absolutely sure about these, because the reports are kind of contradictory, I think is like very important.
Great, thank you.
New York icon, right?
Absolutely.
Part of the parades usually, right?
Part of the parades. It can often be seen in the village, you know, being the door person at places like Henrietta Hudson's, you know, keeping the peace among the community.
Yes. Stormy liked to pack a gun.
Yes.
And make sure all the queers were safe. And then Stormy also had like a very tragic ending to Stormy's life, which is like a really tragic and great example of like how our culture fails queer people, in not just ways that are intrinsically tied to sexuality, but also tied to race and class status.
And from what Stormy did live for many years at the Chelsea Hotel. And from what I understand, you know, Stormy would keep the bathrooms clean of the junkies, you know, would not allow any monkey business going on in the bathrooms there, you know, so. Yeah, thank you. Let's open it up to the people who are joining us tonight virtually, to see if any of the people out there in Zoom land, in our virtual Zoom land, have things they would like the authors to respond to. Any Zoom land questions this evening?
And if you're feeling shy, you can put it in the chat function and we'll read it aloud for you. Otherwise, raise your hand, unmute yourself, and ask away.
Can we see our participants?
Yeah,
Yeah,
that
put it
might
in
help.
the gallery view. There we go.
Anyone. No questions?
I see Lisa there. Hi, Lisa.
Lisa Davis, hello.
Mute this shit. Can you hear me?
Yes.
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 All right, I'll make some trouble. Hi, girls,
That's what you're here for. I hope.
boys, and others. Hi. Stormy was the lady in the Jewel Box Review. She was a showbiz person. That's all. Her presence at Stonewall is highly debatable. Since she had worked for the mafia all her life, she was not, she knew how that worked and was not likely to be making trouble. I'm sure if the cops showed up, she'd be the first one to bail out. And she was very well looked after in her last years by Henrietta Hudson and company. So she was ill, but then she had a lovely memorial service and they buried her where she wanted to be buried. She was just Stormy. She, he, it, who cares? She was Stormy. She was a, a person. But most of the people within that generational category, and she was later than many of the people I knew, were just themselves. They weren't pretending to be anything because they could have cared. They could have cared less, but some of them felt much better wearing pants, which we can all understand. We all wear pants now, most of the time.
Lisa, thank you so much. When you read archives, again, they're sanitized. When you get first-person perspectives like what you just told us, it's like, it really opens up a world to different perspectives. So thank you so much for those very special insights.
I don't know what archives you're looking at. I
I
haven't seen your books, but I will, I promise. I will find them. Greg will steal me a copy or two.
Yes, I will.
Come on
Thank
down
you.
to the bureau.
Thank you. Come to the bureau,
Come to
not the
bureau.
bookstore, the bureau.
That's right.
Yeah, the bureau. Not the FBI, just the bureau.
Yeah, don't confuse
What
us with the
archive do
FBI.
you look at that you find, mysterious?
So the main archive that I used was the Queer Music Heritage Archive, curated by J.D. Vance, I want to say.
Doyle.
So that is an archive that's devoted to mainly the Jewel Box Review. And then there's a couple other archives that deal with Stonewall, and you are totally right. Like, there are many different perspectives and people actually do not know. And there's a lot of narratives, and Stormy's narrative is one of many that are, might have some truth and might be highly disputed.
Many years past.
Any other questions out there, responses, reactions?
I think Joe said
Yes.
that she had a question. So Joe.
Joe, there's Joe.
Oh yeah.
There you go.
Hi, how you doing? Yeah, I had a question, and this is something that, I see come up repeatedly in discussions about marginalized cultures, art forms, that kind of thing. And Lynn, you said it's a book, not the book, right? But there is a lot of times an expectation from people within a community who, I'm trying to figure out how to put it because it's something I struggle with too. The idea that if you have a book, you are an authority, and your authority is a privilege, and you therefore, and I feel like we genuinely are accountable to all the people who don't feel represented. Like, I think that's a real thing. But also, when you say something is a book, not the book, I think that's a hard thing for people to hear. And I struggle with it when I read, because I read a lot of biographies and memoirs. And I think it seems to me that, using yourself as a point of reference really validates the concept of it being a book, not the book. Does that seem relevant? I mean, it's something that I think about a lot as I read, as I write, you know. The fact that you are engaged in what you're writing about seems to me to make it, to authorize you to say it's a book, not the book, in a way that, like, you know, I'm reading a lot of older biographies of people, and like I'm reading a lot about sex work, for instance. Like when you said, oh, you know, I'm not going to be accepted in the academy because of my methodology. I was like, oh, it has nothing to do with the fact that you took your clothes off in public, I'm sure. Right. But I feel like authority is really a struggle in a lot of these, because you don't want, at the same time that you don't want to center yourself as a representative of a movement. What choice do you have? I guess is the question. What choices do you have as a writer, as a researcher, around assuming some authority? Like we don't, like everybody's like, oh no, I have no authority, you know, but published authors do. And how do you resolve that with the idea, sort of the expectations of people who see you as an expert, and see being an expert as encyclopedia, and as whether or not you have any desire to be as representative of everyone involved in that culture or medium? That was 75 questions, sorry.
Yeah, I hate to put this on Jillian, but I'm wondering if Jillian wants to respond to this too, because part of me, I'm going to think about what you said, but I don't know how else to frame it so that one particular voice and perspective and book doesn't somehow get propped up as you know, as the one that silences other people to write their own. So I don't know how to navigate that, but I'm going to think about it.
Yeah, thank you for that. I also bring myself, like I mentioned earlier, into the book quite a bit. So I do think it resists that sort of the book question, but at the same time, I think the authority is important. It's like what you do with it, I guess, right? Because I think of the institutional politics I mentioned, the archival issues that I mentioned, it is important that it does have a kind of authority to it, right? And I think even myself as a writer, and where I come from, you know, and where my family comes from, I think I certainly do want to step into that authority, but in a way that's generous and capacious, right, and enabling of more, I guess.
Okay, well, I think we are at the end of our time this evening, everybody. Thank you all very much. Thank our authors. Thank the people who joined us on the virtual Zoom land. Thank you to Greg and the Bureau here at the center here in New York City. Please, these books are all fantastic. They will open your minds in various ways. The Bureau, if you're here in New York City, has copies. The links to various other places that you can perhaps get these books have been put into the chat. So please, everybody, thank everybody once again for this fabulous discussion about excess through many, many, many mediums. Thank you. Have a good night, everybody.
Give them hell, young people.
Bye. Thank you.
Forget about the academy. Did your work.
Thank you so much.
Good night.
Thanks for being here, Kim.
Bye.
See you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.